So on the one hand, I am deeply upset that summer is almost over, but on the other hand, I'm like, oh my god, spooky season is almost here. Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Today's video is just a chill wrap up. I haven't done one in like 4 months. I honestly intended to do one at the end of June to wrap up like 2 months of reading as I've been doing for most of this year, but I honestly didn't read that much in June, and then I was also coming back from my vacation in Italy, and then I was also gearing up to move in July, and so overall I just didn't have that much time, and I thought rather than wrapping up only a few books for like those 2 months, I thought I would just combine the entire summer. I am reading a couple of books for a vlog that will be coming up soon, so I'm not going to include those books in this wrap up, but I'm going to include the 14 other books that I read over these 4 months. Yes, I am aware that many other booktubers read over 14 books in a single month. I am not one of those people. In this house, we foster a welcoming environment for those of us that just don't have as much time to read and who cannot get through that many books in a single month or even in a single year. As I say in every one of my wrap-ups, you are still a valid reader even if you're only reading 1 book a year, even if you're reading half a book a year, even if you're reading like 30 books in a month. Any type of reading makes you a reader, so never feel bad or that you're not reading enough just because there's people online who read a ridiculous amount of books in a single month. Kudos to them, I'm so happy for them, but honestly, it's not realistic for most of us out here, so this is my very realistic reading wrap-up for the summer. I'm gonna go through these books fairly quickly because I don't have much to say on most of them. A bunch of them were in like different other videos, so you can go watch those videos for my full thoughts. But there are 3 or 4 books that I read over the summer that I didn't include in any other video, I think. So I definitely want to chat about them a little bit more. So first up, I have Sociopath by Patrick Gangney. This is a memoir by someone who is clinically diagnosed as a sociopath, or she finally got that diagnosis, I guess, after many years and months of trying to find a diagnosis that sort of fit what she was going through. This was honestly such an incredible and insightful memoir. I learned so much about sociopathy and just this like sect of sort of mental illness. I think what I found really incredible about this book also was that the author was writing this book and putting it out there so that other people who may be also sociopaths could understand themselves a bit better and understand that they are not alone. Now, obviously, when we hear the word sociopath, we're like, oh my God, this is someone who doesn't care about other people's feelings, but that's not necessarily true. And she explains it really well in the memoir, so I honestly just recommend going and reading it or listening to the audiobook. This woman is married and she has kids. She lives a very normal life, and she goes through that topic throughout the memoir and how she's sort of living with this mental difference. She also talks about her going to therapy and like trying to find all these different treatment options. And I think it was just a really great example of how mental illness isn't just the crazy person in the movie or the TV show who has like murdered everyone. Like, we are more than our mental illnesses, and we are just like other people. We just have a mental difference. By the way, if you're new here, I do have bipolar disorder, so that's kind of where I'm coming from as well, as someone with a mental illness and like living with a mental illness and seeing so many terrible representations of bipolar disorder in books and media. I think one of the reasons why it took me so long to get diagnosed with bipolar disorder was because all the representations of bipolar disorder in media and TV shows didn't quite fit my own experiences. And so when you're getting like these false representations, you think that these mental illnesses are a certain way, but honestly, there's like so many people out there living with mental illness and leading very normal lives and going through treatment and, doing their best. So yeah, I think this book just taught me a lot of empathy for yet another mental difference. There's so much we don't know about other people's state of mind and what's going on in their internal lives. And this book just made me feel so much for the author. Okay, the next 3 books that I read were the last 3 books in the Bridgerton series. For those of you who have been around here for a while, you know that I read the first 5 books of the Bridgerton series way back when season 2 came out and when Netflix like flew me to LA because they wanted me and other booktubers and like bookstagrammers to react to some scenes from season 2. It was a really awesome experience, and I just fell in love with like the show even more. When I read the first 5 books back then, I did have a more favorable opinion of them, and I honestly didn't think too much about some of the issues with consent and like the problematic elements to the books. And for the most part, I enjoyed the first 3 books, but then didn't really like, I think, the 4th and 5th. And so when it came to these last 3 books, and I have a whole video on them so you can go watch that, it had been some time and I had read so many more better romances since reading those first 5. And so my expectations were much lower for these last 3 books. And essentially, if you watch the show or you know the books, the last 3 books are When He Was Wicked, It's in His Kiss, and On the Way to the Wedding. And they're the love stories for Francesca, Hyacinth, and Gregory. So the youngest 3 siblings. Obviously, there's like so much time until we get to those 3 characters in the show. But I was really happy that I read Francesca's book before watching the new season, season 3. Although I didn't like the first half of season 3, I did really like how the last couple episodes really pulled things together and also teased some really interesting developments for the future seasons. So yeah, I just love those like little Easter eggs that I was able to recognize because I had read the rest of the series. But overall, those 3 books were kind of bad and kind of awful. I think Francesca's was my favorite out of the 3, but there was just so many issues that I had with all 3 books, and just the way that the male love interests acted and the problematic way that they tried to trap the main characters into like marriage or into sex or whatever. And everything just felt so sleazy. If I were to recommend to you any of the Bridgerton books, I would say read the first 3 and then just stop, because the rest honestly didn't really do it for me. But this is with the caveat that like the first 3 books also are fairly problematic as well. I think the second book is the only one that's like actually almost fully okay, but don't quote me on that. But otherwise, I would say just stick to the show or stick to other great historical romance writers. Diana Quincy is a really great one. She writes historical romances with Arab main characters, and they are non-problematic reads. They're actually super fun. So that is the recommendation I would give you if you want something different. All right, so following those 3 mind-numbing reads, I did pick up A Passage North by Anuk Arudpragasam. I've had this on my physical TBR for 80 bajillion years, and it is a book by a Sri Lankan Tamil author, and I'm Sri Lankan Tamil if you didn't know. And I think this book was fairly inspired by the author's own experiences, because it felt like an internal sort of dialogue and exploration of the main character's feelings about the Sri Lankan Civil War and his place in that and his emotional stake in it. And overall, the book didn't really have much plot at all, but essentially the premise is that our main character gets a call that the woman who was the caretaker for his grandmother has suddenly died. And he and his grandmother and his mother live in Colombo, which is like the south of Sri Lanka, but they are originally from Jaffna, which is like the northeast part of Sri Lanka, which is where most of the civil war was happening and most of the violence and all that. And so the caretaker woman was also from Jaffna, but she was like living with them in Colombo to take care of the grandmother. And we essentially find out that this woman has gone through literal hell. She has lost so many people during the war, and she is just like dealing with PTSD. And so she was sort of healing when she was with the grandmother. She was getting treatment, but she decides to return home, and then in that time, she has died, and there's this suspicion that she may have killed herself. And so our main character is sort of ruminating on this whole situation, and then takes a train up to the north part of Sri Lanka to attend the woman's funeral. Honestly, that's a whole plot, and that wasn't even much of a spoiler because, yeah, that's all that happens. But what I liked about this book was the interesting sort of introspective tone and just the main character reflecting on the whole situation. He was like working in, I think, India, or in school in India while the Civil War was happening. And so although he was from, Sri Lanka and from Jaffna, I think he felt like he was an outsider to this whole situation, and he was watching the news and like keeping up with everything, and just felt this like enormous sense of guilt because he wasn't there in the thick of things. And I think it was just such an interesting book. I don't know, I feel like I related to some parts of it in the sense that I was a kid when the Civil War was happening, and I was very removed, and I was here in Canada. But my parents were here, and we were all watching the news and hearing all these awful things and worrying about family back home while they were going through literal hell. And yeah, it was just fairly interesting, and I don't know, I feel like the personal connection for me was what really made it for me, but I can also see the literary value of this book in just the sense that it's talking about very human experiences in very awful circumstances. Okay, the next book that I read was Goddess of the River by Vaishnavi Patel. You may recognize this author because this is the author of Kaigeyi, which is one of my favorite books ever that I read, I think, when it came out 2 years ago. And I was just absolutely obsessed with it. It was such an incredible book. And Kaigeyi was basically a retelling of the ancient Hindu epic, the Ramayana, but from the perspective of the evil stepmother character Kaigeyi. And we sort of expand on her story story, follow her from when she's a child into the events of the Ramayana and explore sort of her role in the situation. And the way that Vaishnavi Patel sort of turned the epic on its head and also explored some really feminist themes and the idea of the harms of patriarchy, it was just so fantastically done. Now, I love Vaishnavi Patel and I love her writing, and her writing was equally amazing in this book, Goddess of the River. But I was kind of wary of picking this one up because I knew it likely wouldn't live up to Kaigei for me, just because like I love that book so much. And there's like a very low chance that like something's gonna live quite up to that, even if it's from the same author. And I also knew that this book was a retelling of the ancient Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, which is a much longer epic and has so many more characters. And honestly, although I know the story and I know like both epics really well, I personally love Ramayana better just because it's a simpler story and easier to follow. Although I like parts of the Mahabharata, I don't really care for it as a whole. So yeah, just like premise-wise, I knew that this book wasn't gonna live up to my expectations, but essentially this book follows the character Ganga, who is a river goddess in the Mahabharata, and she's also a character who's sort of at the beginning of the epic, whose son becomes sort of the catalyst for many of the events in the Mahabharata, and that character is Bhishma. And throughout the book we get perspectives from both Ganga and Bhishma, and sometimes they're out of order in terms of timeline, but the book actually does cover a lot of the events of the epic, which is fairly surprising because it's a very long epic, and the fact that she was able to do that was incredible. And it also had very similar themes to Kaigei, but it also explored themes of like honor and duty, which are both very big themes in the Mahabharata. But yeah, although I really enjoyed this one and thought it did a really great job of like retelling the epic, I think because I wasn't as invested in this particular epic, I was less invested in this retelling, I guess. And I also just preferred the sort of pace and plot of Kaigei in the sense that like it follows her from childhood into adulthood through the events of the epic. Whereas in Goddess of the River, I feel like you're following a goddess character, so there's something sort of amorphous about her and esoteric about her that is hard to like contain within the idea of a single person. So yeah, I just felt like she was slightly less of a compelling heroine to follow for me. But again, I think Vaishnavi Patel did a really great job with this book, and it covers the epic in a really interesting way. So yeah, I would still really recommend this one. It's a fantastic book, but yeah, personally it just didn't live up to Kaigei for me, which was kind of inevitable, so I'm not like butthurt about it. The next book that I read was probably my favorite out of the entire summer. It was such a stunning read, and I'm just so impressed by this author's writing, and that book is Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. This is a translated fiction from Japanese, and I've read one other book by this author. It was All the Lovers in the Night. It's a much shorter book and a less complex book, I would say. But Breasts and Eggs is such an interesting book, and it's so funny because I had seen that book everywhere on like tables in bookstores, and I'd seen the cover everywhere, and I'd always thought, oh, I should really pick this up, but then, you know, decided against it. And so I finally picked it up, and I'm so upset that I didn't pick it up sooner. Essentially, the book is split into like two sections or two books. And in the first section, we follow our main character who's being visited by her sister and her sister's daughter, and her sister wants to get breast implants. And so this first whole section of the book follows their discussions between each other and their own personal connection to these aspects of their femininity and like their lives. And it overall makes a commentary on women's place in society and the things that women in Japan deal with. And it also dives into like the experience of being a young woman and growing into puberty, because we also get the perspective of the sister's daughter, because she writes these like journal entries. And so we're reading those journal entries as she is dealing with like, you know, getting her period for the first time, and like hearing about her other friends getting it for the first time and how it's like kind of taboo to talk about and all these other things. And also the idea of like, oh, you know, I could now carry a child within my womb, and that is so strange. I just loved that this book talked about all of those things, I guess. And the second half of the book actually goes in a completely different direction, but still related. And it only follows our main character this time. And we're following her many years later after this visit from her sister. And her relationship with them has evolved, but it's less about them now. And it's more about her personal experiences as she's trying to decide if she wants to get a sperm donor to have her own natural child. She hasn't been in any kind of relationship, and there's an element of her potentially being like asexual or aromantic, but there's a lot of discussion of this idea of like sperm donors, women having children on their own, and also the idea of having a child outside of a relationship. And honestly, it was just so fascinating to me. I don't know, I was like so intrigued, and I loved so many of the discussions in the book. One discussion that I really liked was in the second half of the book, we have a character who was born from a sperm donor situation. And she sort of expresses this idea of the fact that she never asked to be born. And there is a level of agency that is lost. You were born without any kind of choice in the matter. And a parent is sort of consciously making a choice to bring a child into the world, into the circumstances that they have, into this life. So fascinating to me. I don't know. I just loved thinking about this in this way. And I have a lot of peers and friends and, family around me who are having children or thinking about having children or are pregnant. All of this has sort of been on my mind. And so reading this book was just so fascinating, I think, and just brought up so many interesting arguments and opinions and thoughts. And that's partly due to the way that the author writes. She writes in this way that allows the characters to make these very long speeches and like tirades on their thoughts or have long inner monologues. I loved every moment of it. It is such an interesting book. I highly, highly recommend checking it out. It was like definitely a major favorite for the summer and for this year. All right, next we have The Bandit Queens by Parini Shroff. And I have had this book on my physical TBR for too long. So many of you have actually commented on my videos telling me that I need to read it because you thought I would enjoy it. And as usual, y'all were right, because this book was so freaking fantastic. It is like the perfect blend of a cozy mystery, a thriller, a book that talks about some really important themes, and also a bit of a romance, and just like a story of women being badass and awesome. And I just fucking loved it. The book follows our main character, Geetha, whose husband has mysteriously disappeared, and everyone thinks that she murdered him, but in fact she hasn't, and she doesn't know what happened to him. She has been living on her own as a widow, and the inciting incident is when one of the other women in the village basically coerces Geetha into agreeing to help murder her husband. And from there, the story like sort of spirals in that general like cozy mystery style, and it's like a series of unfortunate but also funny events. But I think what was so impressive about this book is that it not only had this sort of light tone and like level of brevity to it, but it also dealt with such important and such like dark themes and really awful issues. Like, this is set in a small village in India and follows this group of women in this village who don't really have many rights, and they've made sort of these small lives for themselves, getting these small loans to make their own businesses. And like one of the things that Geetha just desperately wants is just a refrigerator for her home, which she can't afford, which she doesn't have. And the book also delves into the topic of caste and religion, and also how there are these like brutal killings and lynchings and raping of these young women of lower castes in the village and in neighboring villages, and how there's this constant thread of violence hanging over these women's lives. I had recommended this to some coworkers like online over Slack, and I had said look up the trigger warnings and content warnings because it has some dark and heavy stuff. And so one of my colleagues actually ended up picking up the book, read it, and came and told me that she loved it. And she was like, I remember you said that there was like content warnings, and I had to think to myself, oh yeah, there was like all of that dark stuff that's sort of happening in the periphery and in the background. And it is addressed and it's not made light of, but it's also sort of shown in the sense that these women live with this as a reality, as a constant thing, and as something that's like part of their daily lives. Like, they're just so, in a sense, desensitized to it, but they're also enraged and tired and scared and so powerless in this situation. And they're not really able to, change all these things because they're much larger than themselves, but they do the small things that they can. And I think the overall message by the end was just so beautiful because these women start to look out for each other in a really incredible way. And I was just so in love with the female friendships in this book. It was just so impressive the way that this author wrote this book. And I would definitely be so down to even read a sequel to this book or like a series of books about these characters because I love them so much. And I also would just love to read more from this author. There's so many fun and funny moments throughout all the dark and harrowing things that happen, but it's just so artfully done, and I loved every moment. All right, next up, I, on a whim, decided to pick up Ghosts by Dolly Alderton. I've been seeing this author around social media everywhere for a while, and I know she has like a memoir and she has like other books, but honestly I don't know who she is or care for her as a person. But this book I sort of picked up on a whim because it just, I don't know, seemed like it was going to be a mindless and like easy read, and I just wanted something like that to read on my e-reader on my vacation. And it was honestly just really good and relatable, but not necessarily impressive in my opinion. Essentially, the book opens with the main character's birthday, and she has been happily single. She's been broken up with her long-term boyfriend for many years now, but they're still friends. And essentially on this birthday, she decides that she's gonna end her single era and she's gonna try to date again. And then we are, seeing her months later, and she's starting to date. She's on the dating apps and she's dealing with all of the pressures of modern dating, and she's never had to do this before because like she was in that long-term relationship. She has a friend who's like, been going through this for ages, and like it all just sounded so familiar to me. If you're dating in this day and age, it's like awful, and dating apps are awful, and it's just such a weird experience. So I feel like the book touched on like that aspect of like modern dating in a really nice way and like really relatable and like truthful way. And one of the big elements to this book is that like the guy that she starts dating and really liking ends up ghosting her. That sort of plays into her overall feelings about life and dating and what she's doing with her life, and also how she sort of measures up to other friends who are moving on with their lives in different ways. Like they've moved out of the city, they are planning for families and having kids and buying houses and doing all of these like life things that you're told you need to do, and she feels like she is not necessarily in that position or doesn't necessarily want those things, but also feels abandoned by those friends. And I was like, this all feels so freaking relatable. And it just felt like the main character was like pulling thoughts from my head, because these were all things that I had been like feeling for a while and had been thinking about. Again, like I have a lot of friends and family and people who moving out to the suburbs, buying houses, getting married, thinking about having kids or pregnant or already have kids, that kind of thing. And their lives are so different from mine. In the past few years, I like moved out of my parents' place. I got my own place in the city. My life sort of revolves mostly around my career, whether it's like my full-time job or YouTube. And my priorities are just so different from all of my other friends and like family. And it's just like a feeling of sort of loneliness, but also a disconnect, and this feeling that you can't relate to the people around you as much. And this is probably because I don't have many like close friends who like do YouTube or that I talk to on a regular basis who are in a similar position. So it definitely feels like kind of isolating. And then also the aspect of like, in terms of relationships, my life has gone in a very different way from a lot of my friends and family who have sort of only been in like one relationship for a very long time and gotten married to that person. Whereas like, my dating history has been very different. And so overall, I feel like the book was just so relatable in that respect. For me personally, if you are listening to me and any of that resonates, like you'd probably like this book. But again, I don't think it's like the most impressive book. It's not really saying anything new. It's not really saying anything like groundbreaking. It's a nice book. It's relatable. It has a general plot line, but it's not something super shocking or super interesting. And the book sort of ends with this general nice feeling, but nothing so dramatic or so life-changing, I guess. So in terms of like literary impact or just, emotional impact, it's not very strong, but I did enjoy the experience of reading it and relating to so many different things. All right, the next book that I read was also a book that I read on vacation while I was at the beach in Italy. It was just so freaking fun reading this book. And my partner decided to spontaneously start reading the book with me on vacation. So we were literally like sitting side by side on the beach, and like he's reading it on his e-reader and I'm reading it on my e-reader. And I had started it first, and somehow this man got ahead of me within like a day because he reads at an insane speed. And I was just like so like irritated, but I was also having so much fun. This book is Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood. This is her newest novel, and it is honestly very different in my opinion from her other books. And I think she says this as well in the author's note at the beginning of the book, because this book is less in that like cutesy, cringy vibe that her other books are, and also has this element of the characters having gone through a lot of shit in their past and they don't know how to deal with that in a healthy way. And so their relationship sort of manifests through a very casual sexual relationship, and they don't know how to sort of engage with each other in other ways, and they have to learn that, and they fall in love along the way, obviously. And a lot of their communication actually happens through the sex. I loved the way that the sex scenes, the smut in the book actually served a really great purpose, which was to further the character development and actually show how these characters understand each other through these experiences. I personally related to the main character, Rue, a lot. She's sort of semi-emotionally unavailable. She's also gone through shit. There's an element of her talking about like food insecurity, which I've never actually heard someone talk about in like a fluffy romance, and it was just really nice to get that sort of representation. Okay friends, we have changed location because my camera kept overheating and I've had to like turn it off 10 different times. So we're just moving to the second bedroom, which is much cooler, and we're gonna continue on. So as I was saying with Not in Love, there's this aspect of her talking about food insecurity. She works in this tech science field, and her research is around like making sure food doesn't go bad and sort of preserving it, but in a more like healthy way, I think. And the reason she does this is because she's gone through food insecurity as a kid and like throughout her life. And it's this idea that it's not necessarily that you don't have food at all times, it's that it's unsteady. You don't know when you're not gonna have food. Her mother was on and off with jobs, on and off with boyfriends, and just never had this consistent financial situation, which allowed for them to have, you know, a secure level of food. There was always this idea that you have to like eat quickly because you don't know when you'll get the food again. And that was something that like hit me hard. I don't want to talk about it too much, but yeah, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I really appreciated how Ali Hazelwood has used her books to talk about some really, you know, difficult and interesting topics. Like I liked that this one dealt with the idea of food insecurity, and I loved how Love Theoretically dealt with the idea of like chronic illness and trying to figure out life when you have medical expenses that are just suffocating, and also how that affects your ability to like come to work or to, you know, any kind of situation with a peace of mind and a sense of non-anxiety. And so yeah, as someone with mental illness and like chronic health issues, and then also having gone through some similar experiences to Rue, a lot of her books have just been like hitting for me. And yeah, this one was just fantastic. Honestly, I loved it. I loved the characters. I loved the way the relationship progressed. It obviously got like a little dramatic and a little bit predictable with like the overall plot elements, which I'm not gonna explain, but I do think Ali Hazelwood has an element of like every book has a sketchy or unreliable mentor character who really isn't actually looking out for the main character. It's a reoccurring theme, which I find interesting. But yeah, this book, honestly, loved it. I need to get a physical copy of it because I don't own it and I read it on my e-reader, but it's probably my favorite Ali Hazelwood, along with Love Theoretically. Okay, the next book is also a super surprising one, and that is How to End a Love Story by Yulin Kwong. I kind of went into it thinking that I wouldn't really love it. Although I do have the physical copy, I ended up borrowing the ebook from my library, and so I read it on my e-reader on my vacation, and it was actually the book I think I read like towards the end of the vacation and like when we were coming back and on the flight home and stuff. And this book, honestly, I had read like kind of mixed reviews everywhere. Initially going into it, didn't think I was gonna like it. I didn't see how the romance would work. I honestly didn't even see the chemistry initially between the characters. But essentially the book starts with this like very heavy topic that becomes the reason for why the main characters would hate each other, though it's kind of like a forced hate thing, and it's more from like the main character side versus like the love interest. And it does sort of get resolved as we get past like the first act of the book, and they do become friends, and then it escalates from there. And although I do have some issues with the darker element of the book and how it sort of opens with this situation, I do think that the author did a pretty impressive job of making me believe that these characters were falling in love. I seriously didn't think that it could happen. I didn't think that they were gonna work. And then she showed me that they would. Like, she made it happen. She showed me them falling in love in such a convincing way, showed them both emotionally and sexually longing for each other in such a believable way. And I was honestly just so freaking hooked. I don't think I've been that hooked on the like possibility of a romance in such a way in a very long time. Obviously I love like Not in Love, and I love the way that their relationship progresses, but like it was fairly obvious that it was gonna happen anyways. Whereas this book, I feel like I was on my toes. Like I didn't actually know if it would happen or work out. And although this book is marketed as a romance, I was still like, maybe they don't work out by the end, because there's a lot of like ups and downs and reasons for why they may not work out. And a lot of that has to do with like her family as well and the role that they play in the situation. And I love that it was not only like this big aspect that, you know, makes them hate each other at the beginning, but it's also because of like them being Asian, and also the main character not really hearing like terms of endearment or affection in like the normal ways. And obviously Asian parents, brown parents, whatever, they often express themselves in like acts of service. That is their way of showing love, rather than like saying the words or, you know, hugging you or whatever. I think this book really captured that kind of experience, and also how that affected, you know, their relationship and dealing with a situation where, you know, your family doesn't approve, I guess, or doesn't want to acknowledge things. But it's also like so many ups and downs with the main characters as well and how they interact. But yeah, one of the things that I really did like, and I mentioned this I think in my mid-year book freakout tag, was that I really loved the love interest, Grant. Although I liked the main character, she did get on my nerves in some aspects and she was a little annoying in some aspects, but it was all kind of like fair reasons. The only one thing that really bothered me about her was the failure to have a level of like extra empathy or grace for her sister and her sister's whole situation and what her sister might have been going through to bring her to the point of what happens. And a lot of just blame is put on the sister for what she does, but it's never really acknowledged from the point of view of her probably suffering mentally and going through something like, you know, very internal that no one could have really understood. That tangent aside, I really did love Grant, the love interest, as a character, as a person, as a love interest. Like, he was just such a wonderful character. Has anxiety, he has panic attacks throughout the book. There's a lot of grace and empathy you can have for him, but he's also a very strong character, strong-willed, capable and attractive and intelligent kind of guy. But the thing that really sold me on him was the way that he continuously and without fail always put his heart on the line, laid it out for her to literally stomp her feet on, and still would come back because he loved her that much. I just think that is such an attractive trait in a love interest, the fact that they give the main character space or whatever, and they don't stop trying to be vulnerable in order to, you know, potentially have something happen. I think it's very hard for people to continuously be vulnerable after being, you know, shot down or rejected. And I really respected the fact that he was so willing to be vulnerable. Okay, we're on to the final few books. The next book that I read was Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Q. Sutanto. This is another book that I've had on my physical TBR for so freaking long, and so many of you have told me I should read it and that I'd probably love it. And I think I kind of went into this book with fairly high expectations, just because I had heard like so many people tell me that it was like fantastic and it was so great. And although I found it really enjoyable and I thought it was like a fun, cozy mystery, I loved the aspect of the main character, you know, getting helped by her aunts and her not being able to like let go of this whole like family bond and not being ready to like move on and, you know, have her own life. And I found that very relatable as well. I think what didn't really work for me was just the pacing and like the way the plot line works. I felt like it just was really repetitive at some parts, and that kind of made it a bit frustrating for me in the sense that like they were trying the same things over and over again to like get out of this situation. I think this book just kind of struggled with making more interesting twists. Like, it did have some twists, but I didn't feel like they were that compelling, or I didn't care as much. I just found some of the middle too repetitive and boring, I guess, that I didn't find the later parts as interesting, but it was overall a fun, cozy mystery. So I would definitely still recommend it. All right, the next two books I included in my past two vlogs. So I talk about Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake in my vlog where I wake up at 5 a.m. to make time to read. So definitely go check out that video. And then the last book that I read over the summer was Gothic Hannah by Rue Nix. This was a romantasy, dark academia, teacher-student romance that was like super popular on Book Talk, and I have many thoughts on this book, which you can go check out in the literal 50-minute reading vlog that I filmed and put out. So please go check out that video because it took forever to edit and it took me forever to film. So please go give it a view. Same with the 5 a.m. vlog. It took me forever to film that and edit it. So please give it a view. But yeah, I think for the Gothic Hannah one, like, all of my thoughts are in that vlog. For Alone with You in the Ether, I think the only thing I want to add to the thoughts that I expressed in the 5 a.m. vlog is just that I honestly so wish that I had read this earlier and had read this pre my, you know, bipolar diagnosis, because the main character has bipolar or has a mood disorder and it's like referenced many times, because I honestly just like related so much to this book. But I also just loved aspects of the romance, like how it was just such a weird situation and like the characters are just like so quirky. I just loved every moment of it. Like, it was just something that was just so uniquely weird, like my brand of weird, that I loved it. Another thing I do want to add though is that there's an element of the book like talking about the main character, you know, finding a way to live a healthy life without medication for her mood disorder. The author, you know, touches upon this in her acknowledgements because she also has bipolar disorder, and she also has figured out a way to, you know, deal with it without medication. And I think although that's like totally fine and I'm very happy for her and whatever, I think there's an element of like, this could also make people believe that they can also live life without medication, but I think that has to be done in a very controlled and safe way. And she touches upon the fact that like she was still going to, regular therapy, and she was having her psychiatrist, watch for signs so that if she needed to go back on medication, she was. So I feel like she addresses that fact in her acknowledgements, but I don't feel like it was addressed properly in the book. Like I feel like I just needed some extra bit there to show that like this was still being treated and controlled in a safe way. Because yeah, as someone with bipolar disorder, I know the effects of not being on medication and how different my life has been on medication, and how I probably would not be here if it wasn't for the medication, because a large part of this is just chemical imbalances in your brain, and your brain telling you things that are not true and making you do things that you otherwise would not. So yeah, I think anyone reading the book and like kind of getting semi-inspiration, I think be very careful about going off medication, because bipolar disorder is like a very dangerous mental illness to have. I just want to like make the point that although for some people with bipolar disorder, they can live normal lives without medication and just do therapy or just do other things that, help regulate their lives and give them the routine that allows their disorder to not flare up. There are a lot of us who are in much more severe positions where we need to have medication at all times. We need to live with that reality, and we need to do all of these other things as well. So yeah, I just think all of this is very subjective, and everyone's experience of mental illness is very different. So although I'm very happy to see all of Blake's version of this and her representation of this, I do think that I wouldn't take that as like the only version. There are many other versions and many other more severe positions that people can be in. Anyways, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this like rambly little wrap up for the summer. Let me know what you guys read for the summer. How many books did you read? What books did you read? Were there any genres that like you were hooked on this summer? Do you agree with some of the stuff that I said about these books? Do you disagree? Let me know down below. And as always, if you haven't already, go check out my Instagram, Goodreads, TikTok, and Bindery community down below. Thank you so much to my Bindery members for supporting me and my channel and making all of this possible, and also supporting my publishing imprint with Bindery, Boundless Press, which is publishing its first ever book in summer 2025, and that book is Dust Settles North. More details down below, and if you want to get the exclusive behind the scenes on the publishing process for this book and for the other books that will eventually publish with Boundless Press, definitely go join my Bindery community. For the cost of a coffee, you get all of this extra content and exclusive content, and you get to support me and my channel as well. And it's just honestly a really great deal. So definitely go check that out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye.